deaf. He's RAT.
I'm Stan Lee. I've been writing stories for the young generation for the past 30 years, and in the course of that time, well, I would imagine I receive about 200 to 300 fan letters every day, probably as much as the Beatles. I spend most of my time reading the mail and quite a lot of time answering it. During this time, I think I've learned a lot about what young people think. More importantly, I think I've learned a lot about what young people are. Today, we've come to a time in history when there definitely is a generation gap. It seems to us that perhaps anything that can be done to bridge this gap, anything that can be done to help present the point of view of these young people without being patronizing, without hostility, with respect, with attention, would be a very beneficial thing. We think that a voice is needed. Oh, sure, they talk a lot, and they yell a lot, and they demand a lot, but so often nobody really listens to them. We're going to try to present a voice that somebody will listen to. The voice is needed. We hope it will be ours. Today's show will cover subjects that we feel are uppermost in the minds of young people and, in fact, most of the people in the nation. Things such as Vietnam, rebellion, what the young generation really wants. The hippie rebellion, of course, and that old warhorse, sex. Our guests today are hip and they're interesting, and we hope you'll find the show the same. Thank you.
My name is Skip Weiss. I'm the Dalton School's editor of the Daltonian.
I'm Stan Lee, editor and chief writer of Marvel Comics.
I'm Chuck Skoro, a senior at Columbia College and managing editor of the Columbia Daily Spectator.
I'm Jeff Shero. I edit RAT newspaper, the voice of the underground in New York City.
Now, it would seem that we're an oddly assorted group, I would imagine. I think it would be fun to find out if we're as different as we seem to be, or perhaps as similar as we may seem to be. We may be more similar. I didn't realize that Jeff would have a beard. At any rate, Jeff, I was wondering, would you say that you're more of a journalist or more of a provocateur?
Well, I'm both, because we don't believe that there's anything like detached journalism. There's only participatory journalism. The New York Times and the RAT are both expressing biases. The New York Times is the elite's version of our American history. The RAT is another version of our history, but it's the version of the insurgency.
Of course, the New York Times might not agree. They might not phrase it the way you did. How do you feel about it, Skip? Do you feel that everything that's written is biased, or do you
Yes.
You do really?
Definitely.
Well, now, on a newspaper like yours, the Daltonian, are you free to express your bias? Do you write what you want to write?
Well, we have a certain extent. I mean, if we're going to poison pen somebody, we don't do it. But as far as censorship, we have very little. We can write what we want, what we feel about the administration, what we feel about the school, as long as it doesn't go overboard. Well, we find stuff about administration. After a while, find stuff about a school. It goes like that. But no, we have free press.
And of course, there's been a little excitement at Columbia lately. What's the story with the Columbia Spectator, Chuck? Do you presently have all the freedom that you would like to have on that newspaper?
We have all the freedom that we could possibly have. In 1961, we became totally independent of the university. As far as I know, we've never had anything like a faculty advisor or anything like that. We have to, stay within the laws of libel, and I suppose within obscenity laws. But those are the only things holding us back.
Why didn't the Spectator do more muckraking of the connections of the Board of Regents during the uprising at Columbia?
You mean the trustees?
Exactly. Right. I mean, like into people like Percy Uris, who control a great deal of real estate in this city, who had building contracts from the university and who sit on the Board of Trustees. RAT did an important job of exposing a lot of those power structure links in that university. And I don't think the Spectator did.
Well, I think RAT's not doing a bad job there. You have to remember that the editors of the Spectator change every year. Under the old editorial managing board, such things were sort of anathema. During the things last spring, we were working until we dropped. We'd work, whoever dropped after 40 hours would drop and sleep a few hours, like that.
Jeff, do you find that in a newspaper like RAT, even if you come up with something meaningful, the fact that it's published in a newspaper of your type gives it less impact than if, for example, it appeared in the Columbia Spectator or in the New York Times?
Obviously less than the New York Times, but more than the Columbia Spectator. A good indication is the papers like the RAT and SDS have made an issue of the present head of Columbia Courtier's relationship to the death of Lumumba in the Congo. And the New York Times felt compelled to answer the charges today. So I think we have considerable impact.
Well,
enough impact that the FBI approached our landlord and tried to get us removed from our building.
Well, I know that can happen. I was just wondering, though, it would seem that the physical nature of an underground newspaper doesn't really help to give credence to the things that are said. Most people would think, well, it appears in there, they're just a bunch of radicals anyway. And the fact that there is so much obscenity in the newspapers, I would imagine would turn off a lot of newspapers. I've been wondering, is the obscenity necessary? Is there a definite reason for it?
Well, I am worried about obscenity in newspapers. I always see it, in particularly the Daily News and the New York Times, the stuff about Vietnam and nuclear war and starving children in Biafra. The obscenity is horrible. And we try to avoid the obscenities of the society or deal with them in a good way in the RAT as much as possible. Try to build those forces of change, but the fact is that it's an unseen world that we live in, and so that those obscenities have to enter into the paper.
Well, you see, philosophically, I know what you're saying. But I just wonder, if I were editing an underground newspaper or any newspaper and I had some sort of a message or some sort of a mission, it would seem to me I would want to present it in a way that would give me the widest possible audience. Now, the magazines that I edit, we have all sorts of subliminal messages in these magazines, but we don't do anything in the magazine that will turn any segment of the readership away from us. At least we don't do it intentionally.
Well, I think that's an old-fashioned view because it assumes that people have power, and people in America don't have any power. The only people that will have any effect on where the country is going, the course of the country, are people that are committed, and people who sit at the top and have the reins of power. And it's only young people who are committed to changing this society. And so the RAT is attempting to talk to young people. The vast, globby people sitting out in the suburbs, well, they're human beings of a sort, but they're not important when we're talking about how to remedy the ills of the society.
Chuck, do you know how many, roughly how many readers the underground newspapers have in this country?
Oh, boy, I couldn't even estimate. A great many college students and high school students read underground newspapers.
Mm. And do you feel that they have perhaps more influence than the establishment is willing to concede?
Well, the establishment is seldom willing to concede anything, so I'm sure that they do. It's hard to say how much effect. Underground newspapers, they do speak to a certain audience, and that certain audience is very receptive to what they're saying.
Would you say, Skip, that the fellows at a school like Dalton are part of the audience of an underground newspaper?
Yes. We have an extreme radical movement at Dalton. Matter of fact, last year, before I was the editor of Daltonian, we had a lot of problems with censorship. And so a couple of kids got together, and they put out their own newspaper, the Left Bank, and it was an underground newspaper, and it had quite a bit of following, supported just by the Dalton students. Because people, whenever you have a newspaper, you know somebody else, big brother, somebody in power, is going to say, that's no good, it cuts up somebody, take it out. You're missing a lot. You know what you're reading may be good, but you're trying to think, what am I missing? What's not here? And you turn to an underground newspaper, and you'll find it not paper usually.
Well, the next question, do you feel the word newspaper really applies to your average underground newspaper? I am on the subscription list of almost all of them. I read them. I must admit I get a kick out of them. But if you gauge the proportion of news to the other things in the paper, I wonder if they're any more of a newspaper than your average specialized magazine might be.
Well, I think they are, because we have a motto on the RAT. The job of a radical newspaper is to define and make the news. Now, I don't want to get too abstract, but I think people could understand that best in an area like sports. We have certain established sports in this country, such as baseball and football, and the newspapers carry on and say that thing that happens in Yankee Stadium is important, and therefore they write it all up every day of the baseball season. However, if you look at our society, far more people are interested in motor cars. Many people are interested in sports like surfing or parachuting, and yet that isn't defined as news. Yet those activities go on daily, you see. And so the New York Times defines, in a way, what news is.
Well, now let's
And
get to...
we have a different definition. We're trying to break out of that old tradition, that old consciousness, and have new ideas about what news might be and what affects people in this society.
It seems to me that our original premise was to find out how similar or dissimilar we may be. So far, in the brief time I've spoken to the three of you, I have a feeling that there's a unanimity of thought amongst you, even though you all represent different publications. Now, what I would like to know, and I really pose this to Jeff because I think the underground newspaper is more typical of what we're talking about. What I would like to know, obviously you're interested in change, and you're interested in doing something to society as it is now. What is it exactly that you want changed? How would you want society to be? Because maybe there's a desire among young people that the establishment isn't even aware of. I have a feeling, and I'm not trying to stop you from answering, I just want to mention this.
No,
I have a feeling that the establishment, as we call it, considers most young people as those who just want change for the sake of change and are carried up by the excitement of having the liberty and freedom to yell and scream and make a general nuisance of themselves. I wonder, is there something deeper? Is there something you're all really seeking?
I'm Skip Weiss, the Daltonian editor.
Stan Lee, editor of Marvel Comics.
I'm Chuck Skoro from the Columbia Daily Spectator.
And I'm Jeff Shero, editor of an underground newspaper called RAT.
Now, I think when we left off, we were trying to find out what it is that the young people of the country today are really trying to change, if there is anything that they're trying to change in particular. Anybody want to grab that?
Well, it's obvious that there's basic things, basic problems. I mean, look at the war in Vietnam. People are deeply disturbed about the wiping out of the Vietnamese people and the senseless sending off of our young troops to die over there for political ends, really. The racism of the country is blatant. The universities are factories to send people out into corporations, and the schools constrain people so that they are taught not to be curious and alive, but rather to be disciplined and accept authority. But if we take each separate issue, we really never get down to it, because the malaise is much deeper in America. And it seems to me that there's this whole quality of life question, that in this society with all this wealth, there's no real purpose, that people don't have anything to live for, that the question, we're told we should, for instance, live with law and order, and nobody talks really about justice. And people say, well, success is this accumulation of objects, this house and 2 or 3 cars and a speedboat and that kind of thing, and never talk about daring, a man pushing himself to a boundary that he didn't dream he could make.
Let me play the devil's advocate for a minute. Let's take one of the points you've made. Let's take the law and order one, which we hear so much about these days. It's a funny thing, but we seem to have embarked upon a semantic expedition here in this country where it reminds me of Orwell's book, 1984, where suddenly words don't mean what they should mean.
Yeah,
now,
law and order means keep down black people.
Now,
sometimes
isn't it possible that law and order could mean law and order? People feel there is too much crime in the nation today, and they would like law and order. Why does this necessarily have to be a racist remark? I mean, possibly it may be in the mouths of some people, but I find I'm almost embarrassed to say, gee, I think we ought to have law and order. I find people look at me in a strange way.
How can you say law and order when you see on TV that Negroes riding in Harlem are reaching in store windows and taking out TV sets and dresses, and cops are standing there watching because they're told not to hit these people because they're going to decide a riot?
Should they hit them? Of course they shouldn't. The stores rob them every day of their lives.
You see,
It's perfectly
This is a justification for going and
Absolutely, absolutely. We have material objects by the thousands. Let everybody have a free TV set.
you see,
Why not?
Skip and Stan,
Would you take somebody's life over a TV set? Or hit him on the head for a TV set?
Well, I don't think that Skip was saying somebody
No.
should be killed because of it. What do you think, Jeff?
Well, when you say law and order, and you say you want law and order, you're presupposing that people can get the changes they want in this country at this time by means within, your quotation marks, law and order. But when you can watch the Democratic National Convention on television and see Hubert Humphrey nominated, and a few weeks earlier you can see, Nixon nominated, you really wonder if people can actually get what they want, get the changes they want made within the structure.
Well, let me ask you something about that now. I do not get terribly excited about Richard Nixon or Hubert Horatio Humphrey. However, is it right if there's something we don't like, if a candidate is nominated whom we don't care for, is it right for us then to take things into our own hands? Or, Jeff, as far as what you said, if there's a television set in a window that you can't afford, is it right to break the window and take it? Because this, to me, doesn't seem to be a new wave of the future. This seems to be anarchy. This seems to be leading to something where eventually the minority groups are going to be more injured than ever before, because when law and order break down, the ones who are hurt are the ones that I think you're siding with now. The minority groups and the have-nots become even have-nottier when